The bank is silent in a way that feels wrong, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. You can hear the soft hum of the air conditioner, the faint tick of a wall clock that suddenly sounds too loud. A teller's hands are shaking as she counts bills she's counted 1,000 times before, her fingers slightly numb, her breathing shallow. A man stands a few feet away from the counter, completely still. He isn't shouting. He isn't threatening anyone. He isn't even asking for speed. He just stands there, eyes tired, shoulders slumped, like someone waiting in line at the grocery store. This wasn't the loudest robbery. No alarms blared. No one screamed. No one ran. And yet something about this moment feels heavier than chaos ever could. If no one was hurt, if no weapon was fired, why did everyone who walked out of that bank feel like something inside them had shifted forever? Before we go any further, before we dive deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened next wouldn't be counted in money. 6 hours earlier, it was just another Tuesday morning in a small American town that most people pass through without noticing. The kind of place with one main road, a diner that smells like burnt coffee and bacon grease, and a bank everyone has used at least once. The man standing at the counter was known as Daniel to the people who shared nods with him at traffic lights, though no one really knew him. He lived alone in a modest apartment above a hardware store, paid his bills on time, and used to work at a packaging plant on the edge of town. Used to is the important part. 3 months earlier, the plant closed without much warning. 2 weeks after that, Daniel's mother, the only family he had left, passed away quietly in her sleep. At her funeral, he stood alone, hands folded, listening to the wind move through the trees, thinking about how she used to call every Sunday just to ask if he'd eaten. Have you ever had everything familiar disappear in such a short time that your mind struggles to catch up? By the time Daniel walked into the bank that morning, he hadn't slept properly in days. His apartment smelled faintly of cold toast and dust, the electricity shut off the night before. He wasn't there for revenge or thrill. He wasn't there because he hated anyone behind the counter. He was there because he had reached a quiet, desperate edge that no one else could see. As the teller, a woman named Rachel, looked up at him, she noticed his eyes first. Not angry, not wild. Just empty in a way that made her chest tighten. When he spoke, his voice was low and steady. "I need you to give me what's in the drawer," he said. No rush. No shaking. Rachel later said it was that calm that scared her the most. She followed the rules because that's what you do, but inside she kept thinking, why does this feel like a conversation instead of a crime? As the bills slid across the counter, Daniel didn't even look at the money. He looked at the floor at a small scuff mark near Rachel's shoes, and then he surprised her by saying, "I'm sorry." Just those 2 words, heavy and sincere. She didn't respond. What could she say? In that moment, the bank manager, an older man named Thomas who'd worked there for 20 years, watched from a distance. He'd seen robberies in training videos, all noise and force. This was different. This felt like watching someone quietly fall apart in public. When Daniel turned to leave, he paused near the door, his hand resting on the cold metal handle, and for a split second it looked like he might say something else. He didn't. He walked out into the daylight, leaving behind a room full of people who would replay those few minutes over and over for years. 10 minutes later, Daniel was caught sitting on a bus stop bench 2 blocks away, the money still neatly stacked beside him. He didn't run. He didn't resist. When the officer asked why he hadn't gone anywhere, Daniel answered honestly. "I didn't know where to go," he said. That answer made its way through the town faster than the news of the robbery itself. Rachel went home early that day, her hands still trembling as she washed them over and over in the sink, the smell of soap mixing with the memory of fear. Thomas closed the bank and stood alone in his office, staring at a family photo on his desk, thinking about how thin the line really is between stability and collapse. And Daniel sat in a holding cell, head in his hands, finally crying for the first time since his mother passed away. If you were in that bank, would you feel anger, pity, or something more confusing than both? 6 months later, the town still talked about the robbery, but not the way you'd expect. Daniel took a plea deal and was sentenced to several years, with mandatory counseling and restitution. In court, Rachel spoke about how that day changed her, how she no longer saw people as simply good or bad. She said she started noticing the quiet ones, the people who look like they're barely holding it together. Thomas started volunteering at a local job center after retiring early, helping people rewrite resumes, listening to stories he used to ignore. As for Daniel, before he was transferred, he wrote a letter to the bank staff. In it, he didn't ask for forgiveness. He thanked them for seeing him as human in his worst moment. The money was returned. The bank reopened. Life went on. But the real cost of that quiet crime was paid in understanding, in discomfort, and in questions that don't have easy answers. As you think about this story, ask yourself honestly, if it were you standing there on either side of that counter, how would it have changed you? The morning began the way it always did in that small-town bank, with the same rhythm that made people feel safe without even thinking about it. The doors unlocked at 9 sharp, the familiar chime rang once, and the smell of coffee drifted from the break room down the narrow hallway. Pens were lined up at the counter the same way they were every morning. The floor had been mopped so recently it still carried a faint, clean scent. Customers filtered in slowly, nodding at one another, exchanging half-smiles that said, "We've all been here before." This place wasn't just a bank. It was a routine. It was where birthdays were mentioned in passing, where weather complaints filled the silence, where life felt predictable for a few minutes at a time. No one walked in expecting anything more than numbers on a screen and a receipt in their hand. Behind the counter stood Evelyn, a teller who had worked there longer than most people could remember. Her hair had gone gray behind that same station, and retirement brochures sat folded neatly in her purse, though she hadn't told anyone yet. She moved slowly now, not because she had to, but because she'd earned the right to. She joked that the bank would collapse without her, and everyone laughed because it felt true. A few feet away, near the entrance, a young mother named Claire bounced her toddler gently on her hip while waiting to deposit a check. The child tugged at her necklace, drooling slightly, unaware of anything beyond the warmth of his mother's shoulder. Claire was already thinking ahead to groceries, to dinner, to whether the check would clear before Friday. Ordinary thoughts, safe thoughts. And then there was the man standing near the brochure rack, though no one really noticed him yet. He blended in too well for that. He wore a wrinkled jacket, the kind you grab without thinking, and his eyes kept drifting toward the clock on the wall. He hadn't slept in days, but from the outside, he looked like any other customer waiting his turn. His hands were in his pockets, fingers curling and uncurling slowly, like he was counting breaths instead of seconds. If you'd asked anyone in that room what felt off, they would have said nothing. That was the strange part. Everything felt normal, too normal. Evelyn finished a transaction and looked up with her usual smile, already forming a joke about how early it was for serious banking. Claire adjusted her grip on her child, humming softly, a sound so quiet it barely registered above the hum of the lights. Somewhere in the back, someone laughed at something that wasn't very funny, the way people do when they're comfortable. The man by the brochures shifted his weight and rubbed his eyes, telling himself to stay awake, just a few more minutes. Each of them would later replay this exact moment in their minds, searching for signs they missed. But at the time, there was nothing to catch, nothing obvious, just a normal morning stretching forward like it always did. If you had frozen that moment, it would look harmless. A woman close to retirement thinking about her last year on the job. A mother thinking about bills and bedtime stories. A tired man thinking about rest. Emotional safety wrapped around the room like a blanket no one questioned. And yet, without any warning, this ordinary morning was already becoming something else. Every one of them would remember this day differently. The jokes, the coffee, the quiet hum would take on new meanings once they knew what was coming, but none of them knew who would walk through the door next. The door opened with the same soft chime it always made, but this time it landed differently, like a note played slightly off-key. The man stepped inside calmly, almost carefully as if he didn't want to disturb the air. His eyes moved across the room in a slow, apologetic way, not scanning for exits or cameras but faces. He held the door briefly for an older woman behind him, nodding politely before letting it close. Nothing about his entrance demanded attention, and yet something shifted. Evelyn felt it first, a tightening in her chest she couldn't explain. Claire felt it too, a sudden heat in her neck, her arms instinctively tightening around her child. The man wore a jacket that looked heavier than necessary for the weather, and beneath it something was visible, not fully hidden, not fully revealed. No one could have explained what it was in that moment, only that it didn't belong there. No one shouted. No one froze dramatically. Instead, the room grew quieter as if everyone had silently agreed to listen. The man didn't rush to the counter. He stood still for a second, breathing through his nose, steadying himself. Claire's thoughts didn't go to the money in her bag or the people around her. They went to her kids at home, to school pickups, to unfinished conversations. She didn't think about running. She thought about whether her child could sense her fear. Evelyn's hands hovered over the counter, her smile fading slowly, replaced by something more alert, more human. She had worked through decades of routine, but this was different. This wasn't training. This wasn't a drill. This was a feeling. The man finally took a step forward, his shoes making a soft sound against the floor that seemed too loud in the silence. He looked at Rachel, the younger teller, and for a brief moment their eyes met. In his expression was something that confused her more than anger ever could. Regret. Like he wished he were anywhere else. Like he wanted her to know that this wasn't personal. Her heart began to pound, not because of what he was doing, but because of what he wasn't doing. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't demanding anything. He wasn't threatening anyone. The silence stretched, filling the space between breaths until it felt heavier than noise. People stopped moving. Even the toddler went still, sensing the shift without understanding it. Inside her head, Rachel was already bargaining with the moment. Stay calm. Do what you're told. Get home safe. She noticed the man's hands, how they trembled just slightly before going still again. She noticed how he swallowed hard before speaking, like the words themselves were difficult to carry. Evelyn glanced toward the security camera and then back at the man, her thoughts flickering to her own grown children, to the idea that life rarely turns out as neatly as we plan. Claire's mind raced through scenarios she never wanted to imagine, her body locked in place not by fear alone, but by responsibility. She had someone to protect. That changed everything. When the man finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, almost respectful. He didn't raise it. He didn't rush. He seemed to measure every word before letting it leave his mouth, as if once spoken it couldn't be taken back. The room leaned into that voice, hanging on it because silence had already taught them how serious this was. The object beneath his jacket remained unexplained, visible enough to be noticed, unclear enough to be terrifying in its uncertainty. It wasn't meant to hurt them, whatever it was. And somehow that made the moment harder to understand. Because if it wasn't meant to cause pain, then why was it here at all? The realization didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces, settling into the room like a slow, unwelcome truth. The man reached into his jacket carefully, deliberately, and placed a small device on the counter. It wasn't loud. It didn't flash. It just sat there, ordinary in a way that made it frightening. Alongside it, he slid a folded note forward, his fingers lingering for half a second before pulling away. Rachel unfolded it with shaking hands, her eyes scanning the words written neatly, almost politely. It wasn't a threat in the way people expect. It was an explanation, a quiet one. He spoke as she read, his voice low, controlled, explaining what the device could do, what it couldn't do, and what would happen if things went wrong. He wasn't boasting. He wasn't proud. He sounded tired, like someone explaining a problem he'd already tried every other way to solve. Someone in the back had already pressed the silent alarm. They all knew it. Time seemed to stretch, each second dragging its weight across the room. The man acknowledged it with a small nod as if he'd expected nothing less. He wasn't angry about it. That was the part that unsettled them most. Evelyn felt a chill move through her, not sharp panic, but something deeper, heavier. This wasn't about greed. This wasn't about a quick escape or an easy win. Claire felt her knees weaken as she listened, her mind racing through the words survival and consequences, trying to keep her breathing steady for her child. The man wasn't asking for everything. He was asking for enough. Enough to get through something he didn't fully explain but didn't have to. The room understood anyway. When the police arrived outside, no sirens blaring yet, the weight of the moment pressed harder. The man didn't flinch. He simply looked around the room, meeting eyes one by one like he wanted them to remember him as human. Rachel felt tears sting her eyes as the meaning settled in. He wasn't trying to get rich. He was trying to stay alive. That truth changed the air completely, turning fear into something colder, more complex. If it wasn't money that drove him here, then what line had he crossed that couldn't be uncrossed? And if desperation could look this calm, this careful, what did that say about how close anyone could be without realizing it? But the most dangerous part wasn't what he asked for. To understand how he ended up standing in that bank, you have to step back to a version of his life that looked painfully ordinary. Before that morning, he was the kind of man no one worried about. He woke up early, packed his lunch the night before, and showed up to work even when he didn't feel like it. For years, he worked at a regional distribution warehouse just outside town, the kind of place with fluorescent lights and concrete floors where time moved slowly but paychecks came regularly. He wasn't chasing big dreams. He wanted stability, health insurance, a little left over at the end of the month. Then one Friday afternoon, the supervisors gathered everyone together and read from printed pages. The company was restructuring, operations were moving, positions were being eliminated. Just like that, routine vanished. He told himself it was temporary, a setback, something he could manage if he stayed calm and tried harder. But temporary stretched into weeks, then months. Applications went unanswered. Interviews ended with polite smiles and no callbacks. Bills didn't pause while he waited. Rent stayed the same. Utilities climbed. And layered on top of that was pressure he never talked about. A family member's medical needs that insurance no longer covered. Prescriptions that cost more than groceries. Appointments he drove to in silence, gripping the steering wheel, rehearsing how he'd stay optimistic for someone who depended on him. Each month, the numbers stopped adding up. He sold small things first, then meaningful ones. Pride went quietly, piece by piece. The hardest part wasn't the debt. It was the feeling of becoming invisible, of doing everything right and still falling behind. Have you ever felt that gap between effort and outcome grow so wide it scared you? He did ask for help. That part rarely gets told. He called offices, filled out forms, sat in waiting rooms with outdated magazines and his name written wrong on clipboards. He explained his situation more times than he could count, each explanation shaving off a little more dignity. Sometimes he was told to wait. Sometimes he was told he didn't qualify. Once, a woman behind a desk suggested he borrow from family, not knowing there was no one left to ask. Each closed door left him quieter. Shame settled in, not loud or dramatic, but steady. He stopped answering texts. He stopped correcting people who assumed he was fine. At night, sleep came in fragments. His mind replaying conversations and calculations, always ending at the same place. How much longer can this last? What pushed him closer to the edge wasn't a single disaster but accumulation. The way systems grind down people slowly, efficiently, without ever raising their voice. Missed chances piled up. A job offer that fell through because the start date was too far away. Assistance that arrived one form short. A payment plan that demanded money he didn't have yet. He blamed himself at first. Then he got tired of blame altogether. By the time that morning arrived, he wasn't thinking about right or wrong in abstract terms. He was thinking about survival in very narrow hours and days, about buying time, about staying above water just long enough for something, anything, to change. And this wasn't the first time he'd asked for help. To him, the bank had never been just a place with counters and forms. It was authority made physical. A clean building with glass doors and quiet rules that decided who could breathe a little easier and who had to keep struggling. Years earlier, he'd sat across from desks just like these, hands folded the same way, explaining his situation in careful sentences. He remembered the polite smiles that never reached the eyes, the way keyboards clicked while his future was summarized into numbers. He remembered being told no without anyone saying the word directly. Automated letters arrived weeks later, printed signatures at the bottom, thanking him for his interest and regretting they couldn't assist at this time. Each letter felt colder than the last. To the people who worked there, it was policy. To him, it was final. This building became a symbol of every closed door, every unanswered call, every reminder that systems don't feel pressure the way people do. Over time, something shifted inside him. He stopped seeing the bank as help and started seeing it as a wall, a place where decisions were made far away, insulated from consequences. When you're standing on the outside, that distance feels personal, even if it isn't meant to be. He replayed old conversations in his head, wondering what he could have said differently, what box he failed to check. The shame of those visits stayed with him longer than the debt itself. Walking past the building made his jaw tighten. Walking into it again on that morning felt like stepping back into a room where he'd already been judged and dismissed. Except this time, he wasn't asking permission. That didn't make him proud. It made him tired. But in his mind, this was the last place left that had the power to stop the clock from running out. Inside that room, though, something unexpected happened. The people behind the counters didn't look like walls. They looked like individuals, each carrying their own quiet weight. Evelyn didn't see a policy violation standing in front of her. She saw a man who looked like someone's son. Claire didn't see a symbol of threat. She saw fear reflected back at her. The building that once represented control became a shared space of uncertainty. And in that shift, the story changed. He wasn't just a figure on the wrong side of a decision anymore. He was a person standing in front of them, asking for something no form had room to explain. But what happened inside that room changed how everyone saw him. Waiting became the punishment. Not for him alone, but for everyone in that room. Negotiations began quietly, voices low, measured, careful not to disturb whatever fragile balance had settled over the bank. Instructions were repeated. Clarifications were made. Time stretched in strange ways, minutes feeling like hours, hours folding in on themselves. No one knew exactly how long it had been, only that the light through the windows shifted slowly, casting different shadows on the floor. The man stayed where he was, sitting now, his back against the counter, the device still in sight, untouched. He answered questions when asked, never volunteering more than necessary. Between exchanges, there was nothing to do but think. Rachel noticed things she knew she would carry with her forever. The way his hands relaxed when no one was speaking, as if the silence gave him brief relief. The faint lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often once, long before this moment. The way he winced slightly every time a phone rang outside, not from fear, but from anticipation. Her own thoughts wandered despite her effort to stay present. She thought about dinners she'd postponed, calls she hadn't returned, arguments that suddenly felt small. Across the room, Claire sat on the floor with her child, whispering stories under her breath, creating a tiny world of calm in the middle of uncertainty. Evelyn leaned against the wall, thinking about all the years she'd spent believing that following rules kept people safe, wondering when rules stopped being enough. Regret moved through the room quietly. The man stared at the floor for long stretches, replaying choices that now felt irreversible. He didn't ask for sympathy. He didn't ask to be understood. He simply waited like someone who knew the outcome would arrive whether he was ready or not. The officers outside spoke through phones and walls, their voices distant, professional, stripped of emotion. Inside, the human moments felt louder. A shared bottle of water, a nod of acknowledgement, a whispered thank you when someone shifted to make space. These small gestures didn't solve anything, but they reminded everyone that they were still people, still capable of kindness even here. As the hours passed, fatigue settled in, heavy and dull. The man's shoulders sagged, the tension in his jaw giving way to something closer to acceptance. Rachel caught his eye again and looked away quickly, unsure what she felt. Fear was still there, but it had been joined by something else, something harder to name. Empathy, maybe, or recognition. The silence returned, thicker than before, wrapping around the room like a held breath. And then, just when it seemed like waiting was all that remained, he spoke again. His voice cut through the quiet, calm and clear. He said something no one expected. When he finally spoke, his voice didn't carry urgency. It carried relief, like someone setting down a weight they'd been holding for too long. He told them the truth about the device, and in that moment everything shifted. It wasn't what they thought it was. Not in the way their minds had filled in the blanks. It was real, yes, capable of harm under certain conditions, but it wasn't built for this. It wasn't designed to be used against strangers in a bank. He explained that it had come into his life through a job he once took on the side, short-term work meant to cover gaps when money ran out. He hadn't created it. He hadn't wanted it. And now, it felt like it owned him more than the other way around. The room listened as he spoke, not interrupting, because fear had given way to something heavier. He explained how the device was tied to circumstances beyond that room, how walking away empty-handed would trigger consequences he couldn't survive. This wasn't a threat meant to scare them into compliance. It was a fact he'd already accepted. His eyes stayed on the floor as he talked, like he didn't want to see their reactions. Rachel felt her chest tighten as the meaning settled in. This wasn't a robbery. It was leverage. The kind built slowly, quietly, by pressure that never announces itself until it's unbearable. Claire's fear softened into sadness, a deep ache for a man who looked like he'd been cornered long before he walked through that door. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, taking a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She had spent her life believing people chose their worst moments freely. Hearing him speak, she wondered how many choices are shaped long before the moment arrives. The officers outside adjusted their approach, voices lowering, questions changing. Inside, the atmosphere shifted completely. No one felt victorious. No one felt safe. They felt connected by an understanding none of them wanted but couldn't ignore. The device sat there unchanged, but its meaning had transformed. It was no longer the center of fear. It was evidence of a life compressed into a single, impossible decision. Sympathy deepened. Fear didn't disappear, but it made room for grief. The end didn't arrive with applause or raised voices. It came quietly, the way exhaustion does after a long illness. The device was secured. The man stood when asked, slowly, carefully, his hands visible, his shoulders sagging as if his body finally understood it was over. No one rushed him. No one spoke more than necessary. When he was escorted toward the door, he didn't look back dramatically. He paused once, just long enough to glance around the room, his eyes lingering on faces that would stay with him longer than any sentence. Then he was gone. The door closed. The silence that followed felt different from before, hollow instead of tense. No one cheered. No one cried right away. They just stood there, breathing, realizing how tired they were. Rachel sat down on the floor behind the counter, her legs no longer holding her. Evelyn leaned against the wall, suddenly aware of her age in a way she never had been before. Claire stepped outside into the daylight, holding her child close, the normal sounds of the street feeling almost unreal. The bank reopened hours later, but nothing about it felt the same. The counters were the same. The floor was the same, but the people were. Each of them carried something invisible home that night, something heavier than fear. They carried questions about fairness, about fragility, about how close an ordinary life can come to breaking without anyone noticing. The real impact didn't show up in headlines. The doors of the bank reopened, but nothing inside truly returned to normal. Rachel found herself double-checking locks at home, replaying the man's apologetic eyes over and over in her mind. Every time the phone rang, her heart jumped, even though she knew it was probably just a wrong number. Sleep became shallow, punctuated by dreams she didn't want to have, and each morning she woke to the same tight feeling in her chest. Customers who returned noticed the difference too. The polite smiles were strained, conversations shorter, laughter quieter. Even the walls seemed heavier, as if they remembered the hours spent in tension, and the people who had lived through it could feel that memory pressing down. Outside the bank, the man's family faced their own quiet reckoning. They answered questions from neighbors, from colleagues, from friends who had only heard fragments of the story. They worried not about guilt but about survival, his survival their own, and what the world would see them as after one day's events. Legal proceedings moved slowly, paperwork and hearings attempting to define right and wrong in black and white terms. But human consequences didn't fit neatly on forms. Apologies didn't erase fear. Restitution didn't erase the hours of waiting, of wondering if someone would get hurt. Every person in that room carried invisible weight, and no official ruling could measure it. Some crimes end when the doors reopen. Others move in with you. They settle into the quiet corners of your mind. They shadow conversations, cloud ordinary mornings, and linger in every decision you make afterward. For Rachel, Evelyn, Claire, and even the man himself, that day didn't conclude with a headline. It concluded in silences, in subtle tremors, in questions no one could answer fully. The bank returned to its routine, the clocks ticked, and the hum of the lights persisted. Yet the memory of those hours, the calm, the fear, the realization was carried forward. It became part of their lives, an invisible presence that reminded each of them how fragile ordinary moments could be, and how quickly survival can reshape the way people see each other. The real crime wasn't what happened inside that bank. The alarms didn't fail. The doors didn't fail. The people didn't fail. What failed was the system that should have caught him before he reached that moment. The jobs that disappeared without warning. The assistance programs that were slow, rigid, and unyielding. The letters that arrived too late or didn't arrive at all. Every small denial, every procedural oversight, every missed connection stacked together, until a man who had never wanted to hurt anyone found himself standing in a room, doing something no one should ever have to do. The robbery was only the symptom. The real crime was how society, unintentionally and quietly, pushed him to the edge. Think about it for a moment. Who failed first? The company that closed its doors, the agencies that turned him away, or all of us collectively in how easily we overlook struggle until it becomes urgent? Could it have ended differently if someone had noticed sooner? Could it have ended differently if empathy had arrived before desperation? These are the questions that stay with the people who lived through it, and with anyone watching now. Because what we saw that day was more than a crime story. It was a mirror, showing what happens when ordinary systems forget the humans they were meant to serve. When the doors closed that day and the sirens faded into the distance, something quieter stayed behind. It wasn't anger. It wasn't relief. It was reflection. The kind that creeps in slowly, asking questions without offering easy answers. Nobody in that room judged him, at least not aloud, because judgment would have been too simple, too small. And yet, the weight of what had happened settled over everyone like a shadow they couldn't shake. People carried their thoughts home, tucked them into corners of their lives, replaying small gestures, small choices, and wondering how differently things could have unfolded. There was no hero, no villain, just humans navigating a system, and a moment that neither of them fully controlled. It's the kind of story that lingers long after the cameras leave. It asks us to notice what's unseen, to recognize the quiet ways desperation builds, and to consider how fragile ordinary days really are. If you'd been there, what would you have felt first? Fear, confusion, empathy, or something that combined them all in ways you didn't expect? That question stays with you the same way it stayed with them, because sometimes the meaning isn't in the crime itself. It's in the way it reflects who we are and what we might do when faced with impossible choices. The bank reopened the next morning, but not everyone did. Some returned to counters and chairs, carrying the memory of that day quietly, in ways no uniform or routine could erase. Others carried it home, tucked into sleepless nights and careful steps, reminders that ordinary moments can hold extraordinary weight. Life continued outside those doors, but inside, the echoes of what happened lingered, invisible yet undeniable. If this story stayed with you, let us know your thoughts below. And subscribe for stories that look beyond the headlines, stories that remind us that behind every news article is a human being, and behind every moment of crisis is a question about what we would do if we were in their shoes.